Hello and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian Literature for the Inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, PhD student in Russian Lit. This week, spending the podcast earnings wisely as I bought a wheel, some pedals, and a little sideboard to play Farming Simulator. That is what I like to call responsible podcast spending.
Yeah, I mean, compared to the other things we wanted to spend the podcast money on, which is, and these are all real ideas, a billboard, and I want to say Missouri.
Yeah. Rural Missouri.
Rural Missouri. That's where we can afford a billboard.
That's where we can afford a billboard.
Yep. What is also? I think that's the main one. So compared to the billboard idea, well, a lot of rural ideas going on here. Farming,
right?
Billboards,
right?
I think we're really leaning into a lifestyle. Well, we'll see where this goes. And I'm Cameron Lalana, and this week the universe is playing some sort of cosmic joke on me because throughout my life, it's been very difficult for me to focus on one thing. So I've always kind of multitasked or gotten to many different skill sets. And once I got into news, I thought, finally, just one skill set to focus on. But now they've split me between writing for TV and writing for the internet. So once again, I'm diverted into multiple. I'm multi-track drifting, if you will, skill sets.
What do you ever write for TV like you're writing for the internet? Would that be good?
No, that would actually
send the newscasters the online script.
I actually can't think of a faster way to lose my job than do that repeatedly.
Sending them an Onion article to read. Well, this is a podcast where me and my good pal Cameron get to unwind from our week with some Russian literature and a drink or two. Today, in part 3 of book 3 of War and Peace, we are going to burn down Moscow, baby. It's finally happening. You've been asking Tipsy Tolstoy, when will you burn down Moscow? Today is the day.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're really dedicated to carrying out just fun things for our fans, and especially fun things we see in books like, changing the generations, the freeing of the serfs, the burning of Moscow, all classic little Slavic lit things.
Real quick, Tolstoy fam, if you want to see us burn down Moscow, I'm going to need you to smash that like button, 5-star that review button, and we're going to get right on over there and accidentally burn down the city.
Yes, and after you've invested all this time into War and Peace, you probably want to make sure that you're getting the most out of your reading, and that's why you need to head on over to patreon.com/tipsytolstoy, where we post a reading guide for each episode. That includes quick commentary and major quotes and themes, plus once per month during this series, we're hosting a Patreon-only reading group to discuss everything that we didn't get to talk about on the show.
Plus, we're being really good about adding early episodes for the first time in a hot minute there. So everyone that's on our Patreon account is going to be getting our early episodes for the War and Peace series, which is wonderful if you are just a super fast reader and thinking, how can I get more Tolstoy directed, just injected straight into my veins? That's how. But
that's how.
Yeah, if you're not interested in Patreon, but you still want to help us out, you can leave us a nice review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're getting your podcasts, or sign up for our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com.
Right. And speaking of ways you can support the podcast, we also wanted to welcome our 2 newest patrons, Christina and Marin. Thank you both so much for supporting the podcast and allowing us to keep doing this work we do on the schedule that we do.
And before we get into the reading today, Matt, I have to ask you, this fine morning, this beautiful early morning, what are you drinking today?
So I'm drinking another beer by Brooklyn Brewery, mostly because they came in a variety pack, and that's really convenient for me. It is non-alcoholic beer called Special Effects. It is a hazy IPA. I cannot remember if this is the one from the pack I drank like last time on the podcast, but I think they might all have the same name. I'm legitimately not sure. This one's purple and green.
Sure.
Hey, look at it. Hey, come on.
It doesn't.
Where's the logo?
It doesn't sound familiar. So.
All right.
That looks nice.
It's described as soft, surprising, ripe. I disliked every one of those. I think the worst way to describe a beer is surprising. I think it should probably taste like beer.
Right. If it could be seamlessly weaved into a monologue for the show Hannibal, I think that might bear a second pass.
Yeah. It's actually pretty good. I don't know what's surprising about it. Hey, It's a non-alcoholic beer that's good. Maybe that's surprising. I found them all to be pretty good, so I can't dunk on it too much. What have you got over at, what is this, 9 a.m. your time?
It's 9:25 in the morning, and luckily for me, I don't work until 3, so I have with me
hard liquor it is.
It's time to break out their whiskey. I have from a Sacramento brewery, Track 7 Brewing, a honey blonde ale called Beeline, which is it's a blonde ale, mildly sweet.
Sure.
I don't know if there's too much of a tasting note to speak of, but good, refreshing morning beer to the extent that I can recommend.
Can you give us some tasting notes?
Okay, hold on 1 second. Or should I drink closer to the mic?
Yeah, I think you should slurp. I mean, how else would I know you drink? Oh, yeah.
Tasting notes, ale.
Sure.
An undertone of honey.
Okay.
Yeah, that's about as good.
All right.
That's about all I got.
Beautiful.
There's a reason I'm a podcaster, not a sommelier.
Yeah. Well, no breweries hire Cameron, please.
No, I wouldn't recommend it. I cannot provide that much to you other than telling you after drinking whatever you have to offer. Yeah, tastes good. They can definitely sell this.
Perfect.
I think someone will definitely buy it. You can tell if you want to hire me to consult for your business. You can tell I've got very high level analyses of market situations.
Yeah, that's what I keep you around for.
Well, and speaking of high level market analyses, let's go ahead and talk about the Greeks.
Let's do it.
So part 3 of book 3 of War and Peace starts off with Tolstoy saying, all right, let's talk about some Greek parables. And he gives this classic example of classic paradox of, well, say you've got Achilles, I think it's Achilles, racing after a tortoise. And a tortoise, only moves so fast, and Achilles moves 10 times faster than the tortoise. But the problem is, every time Achilles covers the distance between himself and the tortoise has again moved forward. And, Achilles, once he gets there, must again go the rest of the distance to catch up to the tortoise, meaning, therefore, Achilles will never catch up to the tortoise. I didn't explain that logical paradox very well.
Neither does Tolstoy, though. I mean, it's okay. The point is just he eviscerates the social sciences before they're even created, really. I mean, you have history, but
sure.
Oh man, is it brutal?
Yeah. Oh, it's so. What he's doing, what he means by this is he says, okay, well, of course, now in mathematics we know this classic paradox exists because the idea is, well, how could this possibly exist? If we know that in real life you would obviously catch up to the tortoise, if mathematically it does it. And Tolstoy says, I mean, obviously, mathematically, we can look at minuscule sums, and actually, it doesn't create an actual paradox unless you're using very basic forms of mathematics. But so, too, should we think of the historical study, as Matt said, using this terminology, because we tend to think of history as, in modern terminology, we'd think of this as great man theory, which is not a reputed form of doing history, I should say, even in the most basic history classes you take, in the ones where they kind of tell you the gentle lies to make it easier for you before they tell you the more complex truths later. No one is going to tell you anyone takes great man truth seriously in any modern historical discipline, and hasn't for a long time. However, it was quite in vogue at this time.
I don't know if that's true. I think that people not as seriously as in this one person really moved history, but I do think there is a lot of influence that has had on history. And also there's a whole huge discipline of international relations, which is IR psychology, which is like looking into world leaders and like trying to psychoanalyze them and then saying, oh, this is why they did this. And I do not believe in that.
Yeah, okay, well, IR is not a real discipline, so right, that's why that...
Exactly, that's why that has permeated IR. Sorry. Hate to be the one to break it to you, but I will.
Yeah. No, yes, that's true. So, it depends. And where I went to schooling, it was not a reputed form of doing history. However, it has been for a long time, and in some places and in some disciplines that are not history, it maintains the idea that there are certain people, not that they probably articulate it this way, but the underlying idea is that there are certain people who kind of drive history forward. And Tolstoy takes issue with this even before really you have a name for it, as Matt mentioned, especially coming for history, saying, you know, if we don't understand the idea of the minuscule or the idea of the individual human will, then it might seem the case that there are certain people who actually push history forward, but really it's the mass of all of our individual collective wills, as we've covered in many, many other settings. he's once again restating the idea, although, fun language along the way.
Well, and he's also saying that you can't even understand the human will, basically. Even if you could get down to the most minuscule level, it is ever expanding. You will never be able to fully grasp it. And therefore, any sort of theory just falls apart. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I will say, I think he kind of says it's possible, but he says we haven't even tried. And his exact line, at least what I took away from, was, no one can tell to what extent it is given to a man to achieve in the way an understanding of the laws of history. But it is obvious that the possibility of grasping historical laws lies only on this path being like understanding the individual, and that on this path, human reason has not yet made a millionth of the effort of the historians of that which historians have made in describing the deeds of various kings, commanders, and ministers, and in setting forth their reflections on the occasions of these deeds.
I think everyone would do well to read a little Tolstoy, though. You know how, like, when you talk with, I don't know, let's just say your grandparents.
Sure.
And they're like, history, always changing. How does history change? What's up with that? Well, you should read a little Tolstoy. Maybe you'd start to get it.
Tolstoy is out here saying you should read, and I know that this, I think historically, maybe this has some shortcomings, but Tolstoy is saying read, what is it? A People's History of the United States. What he's coming out here to rep for. Tolstoy says Howard Zinn, Svetlana Alexeyevich, Sadstarkle, big yes in my book, says Tolstoy officially. I'm going to go ahead and put those words in his mouth.
Sure.
From here, he kind of recaps the French advance to Moscow. And like in the way when he denies the idea that the French reaching Moscow was in any way intentional, either on the part of the Russian military or on the part of the French military, he puts forth the idea that it was kind of an accident on both ends. He says also the military understanding of this battle is also flawed because it's not about the choice of whether or not to defend. People can look back and say, oh, he should have done this, but really he didn't make, Kutuzov didn't make the decision not to defend Moscow there. And what Tolstoy says is people accustomed to not understanding or forgetting all of these unavoidable conditions of the activity at Fili, and in doing so suppose that on the 1st of September, the commander-in-chief could freely decide the question of whether to abandon or defend Moscow, whereas with the Russian army positioned within 3 miles of Moscow, this question could not actually exist. When then was the question decided? At Drissa, and at Smolensk, and most palpably at Shevardino, on the 24th, on the 26th at Borodino, and at every day, hour, and minute of our retreat from Borodino to Fili. So, hitting home again the point that it's not, historical decisions aren't one moment. It's not, do we defend Moscow or do we not? Not simple cost-benefit analysis. Even though the Russian army was there, the question could not actually exist because so many other conditions, so much was unknown, and so many things had just already been decided for the military at this point on their long retreat that it simply, as is in the next several sections, which I won't go into too much detail on, we're following Kutuzov and his commanders basically coming to this decision to abandon Moscow. And despite all their arguing over multiple meals and multiple places, Kutuzov from the very beginning knows the only possible outcome because everyone else up to that point is basically just denying the options they have in front of them. Well, not denying, they're creating options in front of them, and only really Kutuzov seems to understand that there is no option in front of them. There is no defense to be made of Moscow. They don't have the troops. They don't have the defensive lines. They have nothing they need to create a real defense, and it's not a victory that's worth winning anyway.
Well, it should be worth noting there are some that want to defend the great and holy Moscow, but it's kind of like just an emotional speech. It's sort of like, maybe not even that they want to defend it, it's that they don't want to be responsible for having abandoned it. And Kutuzov actually gives everybody a really good out by just making the decision and saying, sorry, boys, we're leaving.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the role of social institutions in this part, as we'll come to see. No more war, on to peace.
No more war. Kutuzov has demanded we have no more war in his own particular way. So we go from here to the city of Moscow itself, and we're going to introduce a character. We may have mentioned him before, but now he's kind of coming to his own, Count Rostopchin. And our friend, Count Rostopchin, has been kind of the minister in charge of getting Moscow ready for this invasion. And what that means is he's basically thrown every spaghetti idea he has at the wall, whether that is putting up posters, arresting anyone who kind of seems vaguely French, sentencing his political enemies to hard labor because he can now. Really, he's been doing a lot of work for the throne. Dude's
been on the grind.
But regardless of what he does, the underlying implication of his introduction chapter is nothing he does has much effect. It's a scattershot. It has contradictory effects. Nothing he does really means anything. And in the city at this time, the people are just kind of, for the most part, living their lives. Especially Helena, who at this point is trying to decide what to do going forward. She's got 2 potential suitors, and it's like, well, who do I go with? I'm the most wanted belle at the ball. This is a difficult decision.
The most wanted married belle at the ball.
The most wanted married belle at the ball. Well, that's not really a problem, as we'll discover. It said of her, Helena, on the contrary, like a truly great person, can do whatever she likes, and at once placed herself in the position of being right, in which she sincerely believed all others to be in the position of being wrong. So, regardless of what she does, like a truly great person, she can instantly make herself think that she's in the right. And so she ends up in this process of kind of having these 2 suitors, ends up converting to Catholicism in an attempt to get out of her marriage. And when the religious, I don't remember if it's a priest or bishop or what she's talking to, is like, that's not really how it works. Which, only from Orthodoxy could you be like, I should convert to Catholicism. They seem like they have a more positive attitude towards divorce. She says something kind of in her usual way of not really being truly intelligent, but being witty enough to be and understood as such, at least as the narrator would have you believe. She kind of observes that really, what is religion but observing certain decencies while also trying to get exactly what you want out of life. And the bishop says, well, that's a good view. You're wrong, but quite charming.
Well, you're right, but I don't want you to let you know that you've bested me that easily in our argument, so I'll continue to argue with you for like 2 more chapters.
Yeah. So now in society, the big question is, who is she going to marry? And you might wonder, wait, don't people, like, no one thinks about the fact that she's married to Pierre? And as it said, as for whether it was good or bad to marry while one's husband was living, no one spoke of it, because the question had obviously already been decided by people more intelligent than you and I, as they said, and to doubt the correctness of the decision would mean to risk showing one's stupidity and inability to live in a society. Tolstoy is I've got a bone to pick with society grind in this chapter.
Yeah, I think because he gets kind of the reputation for being like anti-Orthodox church, he says, no, I'm just anti-church, baby.
I'll have you know, I hate them all. I also want to point out that this is a plot. There's a book, July by Tim O'Brien, in which this is, I've never realizing, almost the exact same plot line where you get a character named Spook Spinelli, falls in love with 2 men, and somehow convinces them both to marry her. And then she's like, I actually want to get married to a 3rd guy. And then the 2 men she's married to are like, we're going on strike until you figure out what you want. And then they move in together, which is truly great bromance.
Going on strike?
Well,
got their picket signs.
They use their, like, I mean, you can't just keep they're in this book. They're like, you can't just keep adding more and more people to this marriage. I mean, unless that's what you want. If you want them new guy, just go with the new guy. But until then, we're gonna move in together and just be bros
on strike. Winky face.
That's not the broader point of July. Anyway, so this maybe marriage of Helena and one of the 2 suitors at the top of the town. There are a few people who object, including Helena's mother. I think this is the first time we've ever seen her.
I was going to say there is really a lack of mothers in this society, and it shows. Mm-hmm. The only good one is the Rostov's mother. Yeah,
the only one who reacted in a normal way to a 30-year-old proposing marriage to her 14-year-old daughter.
Right.
Remember, so at this time, Helena writes a letter. She decides, I'm going to marry the older suitor. And she writes a letter to Pierre saying, letting him know we're done. And when the courier tries to deliver, it turns out Pierre is currently on the field at Borodino.
Just wandering.
Just Forrest Gump in it.
Yeah.
And he's just wandering around. He like wanders away from the battle after this horrifying scene, falls asleep in a yard, and then starts heading home. And it was on his way home, it's noted, that he learned of the death of his brother-in-law, Prince Anatoly Kuragin, and of Count Andrei Bolkonsky. Warfare. Am I right, boys?
Am I right, boys? No one has killed off Andrei more time. Like, I forgot that he's killed off multiple times by the narrator in the story.
Prince Andre has like a Marvel Comics level plot armor. Captain America could learn a thing or two about survivability from him.
Yeah, literally. And honestly, I found the funniest picture of Prince Andre that I've been using for all of our videos on YouTube now. So this is a reminder to myself when I'm editing. Andre. I can put the funny picture in there. You'll see why. He's dummy thick. There's no getting rid of him.
Well, that's why you can't stop him. It's just like you can't stop Rakhmetov.
Exactly.
Too dummy thick to stop.
That's right.
So eventually Pierre gets home and he returns to the city and he's just like, whatever, I don't care about whatever's going on. He gets into a friendly conversation with Rostopchin reminding him, don't keep associating with the people I'm sentencing to hard labor. I would hate to sentence you to hard labor too. Which Pierre doesn't love. And he goes home and he reads a letter. And I'm just going to read this line because this is, again, in the line of very funny things that happened to Andre. Very funny, even among those standards. So he reads a letter from his wife finally, which has gotten to him after many, many days. And reads in the letter, the soldiers of the battery, Prince Andre killed, the old man, simplicity and obedience to God, one must suffer, meaning of everything, must hitch together, my wife's getting married, must forget and understand. And going to bed, he collapsed on it without undressing and fell asleep at once. I don't know why my wife's getting married is not the last thing, and like the things he's paying attention to is the part that makes me laugh the most. But it's just in the list of things. It's just, all right, old friend killed. Yeah, my wife's getting married. Okay. Must understand the meaning of God. All right. Well, I'm gonna go to bed. Thanks, guys.
Good night.
So from there we go to the Rostovs, and I'm gonna go ahead and ring the Sweet Home Alabama alert. Because Petya is now at home, and Petya, who's now in care of his mother, it said it's treating Natasha, his older sister, very, very well. And he said, I don't remember the context, but for talking about Petya, he refers to Natasha, for whom, quote, he has always had a special, almost amorous, brotherly tendency.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna, yeah.
So I think like what he was going for is when you have an older sibling, sometimes just by virtue of the fact that they're older, you view them as being cooler. And, you want their respect or whatever. But it's this sort of subclause that he adds in there. I can't remember what my translation said, but it also like maybe goes like, we're going to have to talk about this, aren't we? So...
maybe you just talk differently about siblings at the time, but still whiplash every time.
I don't think so.
Whenever I tried to talk to people about Tolstoy now, I tell them, if you read his books, and you really should start with the short stories first, there are going to be some things you come across and you think, that's weird, but I guess it was normal at the time. And I need you to understand that there is a good chance that wasn't normal at the time, because you need to understand that Tolstoy was a really fucking weird dude.
Yeah. And that's all right.
Yeah.
We named the podcast after him, so.
Yeah, that's true. We can't rag on him too much. So despite the fact that there's a sense growing that the city is going to be lost, life continues as normal. The Rostovs' lives are in as much disarray as they ever are, until you finally reach the last day, and the chapter that opens on the last day of Moscow, so to speak. Moscow's a way of bouncing back. Moscow's, even today, last time we were in Moscow, truly looked like it had just been burned down like a week ago. Moscow's last day had come. It was a bright, clear autumn day, a Sunday. The church bells everywhere were ringing for service, just as usual on Sundays. Nobody seemed yet to realize what awaited the city. The only way you can really tell are the way that many of the people who can leave are leaving. Many of the prices are dropping, an incredible degree, as merchants are just trying to unload everything they have before they take off. And we were, for the most part, we follow the Rostovs' exit, which is slow, it's not well done, frankly. They have all these, wounded in their yard or in their home. Natasha is trying to get involved in packing, which people won't let her. Berg, who married to their oldest daughter, Vera, drops by, and Berg is taking leave in Moscow from the army, not because he's got any business in Moscow, just because everyone else was taking leave in Moscow and he figured he should too. And he stops by and sees the family packing and says, I must offer you my greatest sympathies. This is really difficult. I noticed you have some really nice dresses out there, and I think Vera would really love it if I took those home. And the count just kind of like throws up his hands and walks off on the verge of tears at his shitty son-in-law. I don't think that's actually why he walks off in tears, but
probably one of the worst characters. Although he is kind of comedic relief for me whenever he comes back, because I know something good's gonna happen.
He's like we were talking about this before. Stiva is someone that's comedic, but a lot of people overlook the fact that he's like, even though because he's funny, he's kind of a terrible person.
Right.
No problem with that with Berg. You know he's only there to say to A, be like exactly everybody else, and be the absolute worst person for that moment that he needs to be.
Sure.
So finally, the Rostovs, start off and are able to take off after a lot of difficulties. And on their way out of the city, they happen to see Pierre and say, "Oh, Pierre, you look kind of disheveled," as he's now dressed in like a peasant clothes and just wandering through the streets. Do you want to come with us? And Pierre's like, "No, good to see you, but no, I've got business to attend to here." And they say, "Okay," and they take off. And so Pierre, after he got that letter from Helena, basically just disappeared from his own life. It's only been 2 days, but classic Pierre stuff. So he's been living in his deceased, the man who got him into the Freemasons. He's been living in that man's house, who is now dead. And he's kind of just following orders from this guy's like widow to packing stuff up so she can flee the city. And as the French troops enter the city, he gets this grand daydream that I can stop this. I will be the one to turn the tide back. And how will I do that? I'm going to kill Napoleon. And so he gets a gun and he gets a knife, and he heads out into the city trying to find Napoleon to kill him. And along the way has several adventures, which actually, sorry, by the way, I should go back. I didn't mention this earlier, but we do have one chapter, very brief chapter with Napoleon at the start, overlooking Moscow, which does have the humorous moment of where Napoleon gets lost in fantasy, imagining how he's going to give a speech to the boyars of Moscow, which will bring them around to him before his officers kind of awkwardly, not really, they don't tell him that actually all the nobility of Moscow have kind of left already. They're just like trying to figure out how to break this news to him because no one wants to look ridiculous when Napoleon just gets bored of it and orders a charge into the city, which is very short-lived because they realize once they charge the city that no one's actually defending it, and they're really disappointed. So that's how the French invasion of Moscow is going. So as Pierre is wandering the city, he runs into a couple different events. As Tolstoy notes, it's a dead city. It's an empty city, but it's not a lifeless city. It does not have the normal city life. It does not have the merchants and all these classes and all this interaction. It just has people continuing on, and people who are frankly feel pretty slighted at the fact that they've been left behind. A lot of them send to as Pierre's walking through, they're kind of getting angry at the law and at the nobility, saying, where have the gentry and the merchants have gone? They've just left us to perish. Did they think we're dogs wandering the streets? And Rostopchin is still there, still being a dick. And he says, now that we're in our final moments, I can get rid of all the people I hate. And he he just starts giving out his final orders. And he's really mad that Kutuzov is asking him to help the retreat, because it's, even though it's not really his fault, he feels it's somehow an admission that he failed. And so he gives a bunch of useless orders, which are really only going to be counter to the effort to retreat from the city, and says, "Oh, who are those people we've arrested for hard labor? We should just go ahead and execute them." Even though, as the novel notes, they had not been, in fact, despite the fact that he believed they should be executed, they'd only been sentenced to labor. So, classic wartime stuff. Tolstoy says to this, because Rostopchin, through this entire series of events, believes that he is the controller of public order. He is the one everyone's looking to for what do we do next? What is our next step? How do we maintain this public calm? And Tolstoy says of this attitude, one need only admit that public tranquility is in danger, and any action finds a justification. All the horrors of the Reign of Terror are based only on solicitude for public tranquility. So what happens here is Rostopchin orders a prisoner who is sentenced to hard labor and puts him in front of a crowd and says, "All right, here's the man responsible for letting Moscow fall. Go ahead and beat him to death." And the crowd is like, what? They're just kind of mostly confused. And like, they mostly feel bad for the guy until one of the hussars like pulls a saber and wounds the guy. And then that a certain bloodlust in the crowd kind of takes over, and they end up beating this guy to death. Although, and they end up almost beating someone else to death just incidentally because he was too close to the crowd. Rostopchin walks away, and he's now in this quiet moment faced with the fact that, does anything I do mean anything? As Tolstoy notes, since the world began, men have killed one another. Since the world has began and men have killed one another, no one has ever committed such a crime against his fellow man without comforting himself with the same idea. The idea is le bien public, the hypothetical welfare of the people. But so although Rostopchin finds himself kind of haunted by these events, he says, well, I couldn't have done anything else. People expected that of me. I had to do it, which of course is an invention of his own mind, but an invention which drives him onward. From this point onward, Tolstoy talks briefly about why did the fire of Moscow come to be? And he says, the French attributed the fire of Moscow a patriotismo feroce de Rostopchina. I'm not even going to apologize for my French accent. I truly so far outside of knowing any French. The Russians, which means the fierce patriotism of Rostopchin. The Russians to the barbarity of the French. However, it was not and could not be possible to explain the burning of Moscow by making any individual or any group responsible for it. Moscow was burned because it found itself in a position in which any town built of wood was bound to burn, quite apart from whether or not it had, 130 inferior fire engines. Deserted Moscow had to burn as inevitably as a heap of shaving has to burn, on which sparks continually fall for several days. As he points out, all the French army arrive. Nothing's there. They start to loot. They go off in their own way, lighting fires, trying to get warm. It's cold. It's the winter. And because most of the people have left, as he said, there's basically no one to tell them, hey, don't light a fire here because this is a bad idea in a wooden city.
I don't think this Tolstoyism is that interesting because literally he's just like, yeah, wooden city, gonna burn. That's about it. Nothing else to say. I could have told you that. Don't build cities out of wood.
A lot of cities are built out of wood, so I guess there's...
Stop. Don't do it. Use something else.
Use a different material.
Use something that's not going to go up in flames like that.
And so, Pierre's wandering around the city under his delusion that he can kill Napoleon, and ends up saving a French officer from being shot. The French officer is like, you must be French. You speak French so well. You've got you don't seem like a Russian, and you seem too good to be one. Which Pierre is like, yeah, and Pierre is like, doesn't take well to it, but he's also just terminally accommodating, so he just hangs out with the officer for the rest of the day.
They're just having a boys' night. They had some wine, talked about past love. I mean, hey.
Yeah. So the city of Moscow is burning and taken, and Pierre is taken away from his quest of vengeance to go have a boys' night. And the next morning, he goes out, wandering the streets, many people out. Among them is a family who's lost their daughter in a fire. Pierre goes and finds her as the French are looting the house, which is on fire. The daughter's just kind of sitting in the garden. And as he comes back, he finds a French soldier attacking a young Armenian woman and, pounces on him and starts beating him until other French soldiers arrest him and take him away as being a suspicious element. And that's where we leave book 3, Moscow burning. Also, sorry, should note, very minor side point, as the Rostovs are heading out, they realize they gave up a lot of their possessions so they could take many of the wounded with them, which was not a quick decision. That's a lot of back and forth in the story before finally they say, all right, I guess we can give up a couple dressers if it means we can take some wounded out of Moscow. And they find out that Prince Andrei is not only not dead, but he is among the wounded who's been brought to their house.
Right.
Natasha finds out he's there and one night goes out to go see him, and he's in this complete daze, totally out of it, before comes back briefly to realize she's there with him, and they have their little moment before we zoom back out.
Yeah, they get their kind of forgiveness moment. I don't know if it's manic pixie, but it is just dream girl moment, I guess, because Andrei's in just an absolute fugue state.
Well, it is a little manic pixie because, like you say, he is in a manic fugue state.
Yeah.
Because he's been shot. And is probably really infected at this point.
Right. Yeah, he does.
As the doctor prescribes him fresh air for the infection.
Always known to do well for infections.
So that's book 3. This has This has been the historians love to call everything the long century, just so they can fit any pieces of dates into whatever their theory is. Right. This is the long 1812.
Hey, don't tell everyone that we do that. Like to do that in literature as well.
It's a great technique. I won't bash it. I just will call attention to it. Many other parts of this book will cover 2 to 3 years each. We've been covering 1812 for the entirety of book 3. I want to say maybe even at the end of book 2.
Yeah, it's going on. A lot of stuff. Well, kind of a lot of stuff happening.
Yeah,
sort of.
It's a lot of not pushing the plot forward, but it's a lot of set dressing. I don't want to call it set dressing. It's like it feels a lot more like Stalingrad in this part, saying the intricacies of a city at siege,
or like the people within the city.
Right. Yeah.
Although it's different because people are not being burned inside their cities alive. Pierre is just having wine with the Frenchman. So
it's definitely a vision of a city at siege written by the nobility.
Right.
I think not that this is an especially like incisive point, but the nobility are individuals, and the peasants and the poor and the urban laborers are all a mass. They don't really get to be individuals, which is very much not the case in Grossman. Everyone is an individual in Grossman's work. It doesn't matter who they are, especially the lower they are, the more Grossman's interested in them, which is not the case here. But there's an overture, I would say, towards the feelings of the people, even if it is as a mass. They don't get to be individuals. They do later in this part express like, well, we're not dogs, we're human beings. Why are we just being left behind when the nobility get to flee? And even the nobility are leaving behind their servants because they're like, well, we want to come back eventually, so we do need someone to keep this place kept well.
Who's going to haul all my crap back if they come with me?
We need someone to put this stuff back in, so you guys got to stay behind, obviously.
Yeah, just nobility things.
Just nobility. So you do see a little bit of that, an overture towards it, but not obviously as much as you'd see in later literature, which is by no means surprising or a condemnation of War and Peace. It just is a difference in eras. Is there anywhere you want to start in talking about in closing out book 3?
Yeah, I think we need to touch a little bit on the Catholicism of it all, just because I think that I don't really know how true to form Tolstoy's critique is here, but I think it gives you an interesting look at how Russia views the West, and Catholicism is kind of just used as this sort of amorphous West stand-in in this point, I think. This is something that pervades even to this day. If you look at how the Orthodox view the Catholics, this is in my experience here, Catholics sort of have this rational bent, and at least that's what this is portrayed as in War and Peace. This is how some people think of it. Might not be your own, dear listener, may not be your own experience with Catholicism. Not here to comment on that. But this is how it's coming through in the book. This is like the foundation of what is comical in this scene, which is as soon as Ellen can kind of find like any sort of like logical, rational way out of her marriage that absolves her from this mystical union, which it is supposed to be. And instead, she says, "But I imagine that having espoused the true faith, I cannot be bound by any obligations imposed on me by a false religion." And her spiritual father is like, "Good point." And that's kind of what, gets her out of it. And so she
pulled in the Henry VIII in that one. She said that the church won't condone it. I'll go to a church that will, or create one.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a differing point between the Orthodox and the Catholics as it's like viewed in the novel, where the Orthodox church, it is viewed as being, as Tolstoy says, yes, there's a lot of influence from the state on it. That's what you get with Natasha when she goes to the services and the priest is up there railing against, the French, and we got to kill the French and also pray for our enemies. And so, he has some theological issues. There's some issues between church and state, of course. But the Catholics, I think he also sees this sort of corruption as being built into the system itself, which is if you can kind of reason it, then, hey, you can get out of doing whatever you feel like. And I don't know how spot on that is for Catholics. I think if you were to apply it more towards Protestants, I think Tolstoy would have had quite a lot to say about Protestants as well. But so, I don't know. I don't want to go too far into that. That's a separate issue. I do just want to say that this is a major part of the East-West division is obviously the Great Schism between Orthodox and the Catholics. And so that has like a huge foundational setup for how these two sides, even though they are similar, there's these sort of long-standing historical differences that have allowed them to sort of develop differently. And Ellen, she's not a good look for the Catholics to sort of absorb into their system, because she, maybe it's not a commentary on the system itself, but a commentary on how individuals can corrupt within systems. But it's interesting. I don't know if any of that made sense, but
no, I'm following with you. I'm following with you.
I'm just trying to figure out how I can offend all religions at once.
Sure. Oh, trust me, I've got a long history at that. I can do that for you.
Right.
Typical. As someone who was raised Protestant, I'm very adept at just walking over everyone else's beliefs, because Protestants take nothing seriously, not even their own religion. Yeah, that's my job, to get the Protestants mad too. But it's the larger. It's mostly comedic. It's kind of it's a small scene in which he converts to Catholicism, but it really. Tolstoy obviously had huge problems with organized religion of any sort, and so he was never going to like Catholicism. But also to add on the individual addition of a person, in this case Helena, who is like, well, isn't the point of religion really just to satisfy my needs? And then everyone else around her being so enamored, they're like, good point.
Could be. Yeah, haven't thought of it.
I think that's actually what Jesus is talking about in the Gospels. When he goes into the temple and he sees all the money lenders, he says, well, I mean, as long as they observe the certain decencies of Judaism, I guess it's all right for them all to turn this temple into a place of commerce, as I recall the story goes.
Right. Well, I think the irony really is even all of these people, like, they don't read the gospel. It's just, he's really commenting on is the sort of infusion of sort of like the really legalistic side of religion that gets infused with the state, and how do we as the upper class kind of use that and bend that to our will. And none of these people care at all about religion, except maybe Princess Maria, you could argue, and Natasha for like 20 pages. But like, aside from that, that's about it.
Yeah, I do want to say this: the start of this chapter is strong, or the part of the book.
Oh, he comes out swinging.
It's a good one. It's the same point he's been making every time, but again, he comes out swinging every time.
Swinging.
He's finding new ways. Before, he's just like, let me just go on a rant about historians. Now he's like, let me go on a rant about Greek mythology and tell you why that actually.
Right. I was like, all right, we're starting with some Achilles. What's going to happen? Then I was like, oh, social sciences again. You got me.
Yeah. I mean, but I think he touched on this briefly. I don't remember where this is from, but he says, chess players will, when they lose a game, will look for their mistake in their opening move, but they forget that it was not only in the opening move, but in every action after that, which was affected by that mistake in the opening move, which also was a further mistake, which leads into this idea that we need to. Although it's not super interesting to say, again, history is not made up of the great people, the ones who push us forward, but rather all of us together. I do think is an interesting point to him coming out and saying we need to understand history not as the will of a few, but rather the collective action and belief of everyone, and that history is not a series of events. It's not you can go from battle to battle to understand history. It's you have to understand every point in between that battle. If you want to understand why was this battle won, it's not enough to say because they made the right decisions. It's because these troops marched there earlier, they had a more favorable position, they had better morale, a million things that happened even on the day before.
What kind of bread did they have for breakfast? That is the urgent question I must know.
It's continuous. There's no stopping point. You can stop and say, this is how to understand history. It's every point of history explains every other point in history, which, not a historian can explain. Again, pretty difficult to write history that way, but possible. Even if it might fall into the same trappings, like some of the authors you mentioned before, obviously Alexievich, Turkel, maybe even Zinn, or Howard Zinn, I should say. I don't think we've talked about him before, but I don't know if I have too much to add to that. Just Tolstoy has a salient critique of history before history is a recognized discipline. I mean, as we understand today, history has been a discipline since forever, but history at one point was just like Thucydides being like, so I talked to this guy and he told me this funny story and I'm going to tell it to you over the next 400 pages.
I wanted to talk a little bit about authority and violence, because this is a big part of this chapter, especially the times when the city is kind of just in this like anarchic state and everyone's just like running loose, looting, burning, whatever everyone's doing. And I thought that there was a really kind of interesting point here on violence being witnessed and also perpetrated communally with this like mob violence scene. And it is now the complete disintegration of the barrier between war and peace. So we finally have done it, boys. We are at the point of the story, which is war and peace as not two separate things, but one thing existing together. They're no longer just similarities between the two that we can see, but they're happening at the same sort of time. There's no peace without war, and vice versa, I guess you could say. And
importantly for this book, it only took us 900 pages to get here, so it's actually a pretty short journey.
Well, I have this on page 1035, so a little over. In my copy's a little bit longer because I got these short, like, this bad boy. It's a little lad.
The thick one.
With this tiny old text that I get to strain my eyes reading. So, yes, there is this quote, right, that you mentioned. The barrier of human feeling, strained to the utmost, but still holding the mob in check, gave way. Once begun, the consummation of the crime was inevitable. And it is very similar to how war also kind of works. It kind of, again, I think Tolstoy is figuring out how momentum works in social groups, right? Like how, if everyone around you is doing something, you will feel more empowered to join in, or unconsciously even join in and engage in whatever the group is doing. In this case, it's a mob. So of course there's probably more interesting things to learn about in terms of mob psychology nowadays than Tolstoy was onto here, but he's definitely onto something. And it goes into my larger point on this chapter, or rather this book, which is, how do we use social institutions to our benefit? We've talked a little bit about Helena, how she's using the Catholic Church to her benefit, but there's this sort of like smaller scale institution, if you'll indulge me here, the mob or the military. A mob is not really an institution, but they sort of serve this same purpose, which is to de-individualize you, to sort of alleviate any sort of burden on you, any sort of stress that you might be doing the wrong thing. And that to me seems to be a really big point here. Like, this is the function of bureaucracy, it is the function of institutions, and on a very small scale, the function of the mob, which is when you do things as part of this larger group, hey, it wasn't really me, it was the larger group, it was the institution. I have done no wrong. And so this is really an issue with society that Tolstoy sees, which is that nobody takes any sort of accountability for their own actions. As we've said, when will you learn that your actions have consequences? I don't know. It seems like people are not learning. No.
No. Yeah, and more on more than one level, are not only are the individuals, in this case the institution, the mob, the military, not learning. You also have Rostopchin, who is in this case kind of referred to as the administrator, but I think you could roughly take that idea out to also the administrators, the military, the generals, in which it said that in untroubled times, it seems to every administrator that it is only by his efforts that the whole population under his rule is kept going. And in this consciousness of being indispensable, every administrator finds the chief reward of his labor and efforts. And while the sea of history remains calm, the rural administrator in his frail bark, holding on to with a boat hook to the ship of the people and himself moving, naturally imagines that his efforts move the ship he is holding on to. But as soon as a storm arises, it's impossible to maintain that illusion, which is a point he's been making over and over again, both in the military and in the civilian sphere. And like you said, it comes clashing home here when it's colliding home here with the actions the administrators having not no effect. Obviously, it does affect the people, but clearly nowhere near the effect they believe they have, nowhere near the control they believe they have.
Yeah, there's this other good quote that says, the officials, the heads of the various government departments, knew as well as Count Rostopchin that Moscow would soon be in the hands of the enemy, and to evade personal responsibility, they had all come to the Governor General to ask how they were to deal with their departments. Which kind of shows, right, like their sort of viewpoint of authority, which is not as people always assume, which is just, this is top down, me telling you what to do. This is the authoritarian rule that Russia has always had. This is this myth that is pervasive nowadays still. There is another view of authority in Russian history and literature that is both positive and negative at the same time, which is that authority is a burden. It absolves you from having to have responsibility on yourself when you can always look up and say, hey, that guy told me to do it. You know, that's a really big portion of what is happening in this. And when times get really tough, you can always point at somebody else, which is positive for you, but it's still, it's incredibly negative for the society as a whole, because people abuse what limited power they have, and the whole thing kind of goes crumbling down as Moscow, the city itself, goes crumbling down as it's burnt, because no one's taking care of anything. No one's looking after anything. Nobody knows who to ask for anything. It's just disaster.
Yeah. It's a foreign army in a wooden city.
Yeah. That sounds like the beginning of a joke.
Yeah, but I think that covers a lot of the major points here.
No. No. We're going more. We got at least two more points to cover, baby.
All right, let's cover them. What do we got?
All right. We got Pierre. We haven't talked about Pierre.
That's
Pierre,
right.
in this part, to me, reminds me a lot of a Dostoevsky character. I think he could almost be like a Raskolnikov.
I had that thought. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt the whatever it is, I am on the same wavelength as you.
Yeah, so I think that he obviously is like almost like inverse in the action of Raskolnikov, in that he saves someone from dying instead of murdering the pawnbroker. But he kind of, he has his plot. He does a lot of this like aimless, mindless sort of like wandering around, mumbling to himself. But ultimately he has this like overwhelming sense of just impotence, which is how Raskolnikov spends the entire book after the murder. And so there's like this very kind of similar overlap. There are a lot of similarities in the scene of Vereshchagin being killed by the mob that sort of maybe mirror the imagery in Crime and Punishment of the horse being killed, which is also this example of communal violence being witnessed. And it's interesting, is all I'll say. I don't know if I can draw the comparison completely, but for people that say Tolstoy and Dostoevsky just so completely different, blah, 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 there are a lot of overlaps between the two that you might find interesting if you're really kind of looking for them.
Mm-hmm. This one, I think, is a little more obvious because it's someone who is formerly highborn or formerly doing well, now in peasant clothing, wandering the streets, talking to the rabble and the crowd,
right,
and the general public, which Tolstoy does not not usually address, which I think maybe why I didn't think about War or Crime and Punishment specifically, but just the entire, the scene, the setting, what he's paying attention to is very Dostoevskian, to your point.
Yeah.
In this part.
It's different than the rest of the book for sure. And then the very last point that I wanted to touch on was the differences between the generals. You have Kutuzov and Napoleon here, and we have, of course, the scene of Kutuzov just saying, we're done, we're going to retreat. There's nothing that we can do at this point. City's going to burn. City's going to burn. Sorry about it. Enjoy the view. And you have Napoleon, who he's winning the battle, but Tolstoy shows you how the seeds of his own destruction are being sown, and that besides the scene with Pierre, what's really going on outside of this small, tiny aristocratic viewpoint is that these soldiers are going nuts, and they're beating people in the street, and they're looting the city, and they're bringing all their crap with them, which, as he notes, they basically are like a monkey that reached into a jar for a handful of nuts and can't drop them now. And despite of the fact that Napoleon develops this commission or whatever, this group of soldiers to go make sure that there's public order and to make sure that their own soldiers aren't looting, he has no control over his own troops. So how is he supposed to conquer the whole world when no one's going to listen to him, when everyone's just going to do what they want to do anyways? And I think that Kutuzov, this is the deciding like mirror image of the two. This is why Kutuzov comes out on top eventually. Spoiler alert.
I don't know if you would know this, but Napoleon doesn't win the war.
I don't know if you right. I don't know if you know this. Napoleon does actually lose, and then he gets to go on a tropical island getaway.
He gets to go on a little tropical island vacation, his own little personal love island. Not there are fewer Brits, I believe there. Well, not anymore, but that's a different matter. I don't know if you took this away. But when Napoleon is in his deep daydream of the boyars coming to love him and him giving such an extravagant speech, it really paralleled a lot of Pierre's early days when Pierre's just in his room imagining that he's giving such an extravagant speech to Napoleon. And it feels like it brought, I mean, this is what Tolstoy's been doing this whole book of like, really, how much control does Napoleon really have? But I think it was some of its most effective for me is just drawing that very clear and obvious parallel to a character who is always impotent, always just kind of things happening despite him, and
right.
Seeing more and more of a connection between the two in the way they just act in their day-to-day life.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I didn't really connect the two daydreams, but they are kind of similar. And then, okay, very last thing. I gotta mention it. I'm not going to talk about it yet, but Prince Andrei discovers the truth of the world, which is that he learns how to love his neighbor. He learns who his neighbor is. This is in the scene between him and Natasha, and this will be important later. We don't have a ton of time to go into it now, and it's still kind of like in its primordial development for Tolstoy. So it'll be interesting to track how that goes, whether it stays. And as we're heading into the last part of the book, I mean, we're in book 4, so I mean, we got the epilogues, but we'll be wrapping it up pretty soon, and so we'll be able to finally see what Tolstoy thinks. Like, where do the characters end up, and was it a good spot for them, or were they naughty characters and they get something bad in the ending?
Which of our characters get coal in their stocking this year?
Exactly, that's what we're here to answer.
And you'll find out next time. But Matt, I have to ask you, before we wrap up, what parts of book 4 are we going to be covering next time?
All right, so next time we're going to be reading book 4, parts 1 and 2. And then the last couple episodes, we're just going to be doing book 4, part 3, book 4. I can't talk. Book 4, part 4.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm going to cut that out. I'm just going to leave the first part.
All right.
Check the website if you want to know our reading list. It's finally updated.
And also, I have to ask, as we're closing out, what is your zinger of the week?
My zinger of the week I did talk about, but I liked when Tolstoy compared Napoleon's troops to the monkey having seized a handful of its nuts. And specifically, I had to choose like an earlier part of this quote, because if you take it out of context, the way the translation translates it is the monkey having its handful of nuts, yada, yada, yada. And I just thought it was funny because I pictured a monkey grabbing his nuts. So I quite enjoyed that.
Sure.
You can go back and check me if you want. It's pretty funny. How did you end up on a scale from 1 to Yeltsin? I assume not too high with one beer, but
sure. No, with one single beer, I am on like a 1.5.
Oh no! But it is 9:30 a.m.
It is 10:30 now, but
okay.
Yeah, still that's actually probably ideal, so I can have enough time to go and make lunch and clean up before I start getting ready to head to work. But
Sure.
Well, before we let you go, we wanted to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current patrons: Christina, Marin, JG, Banana Karenina, Danielle, Margarita, Yulia, Amanda, John, Natalie, Halil, Ben, James, Elizabeth, Shannon, Blake, Amanda, Maya, Pack Rob, Zachary, Austin, Isaac, Brett, Caitlin, Eli, Stephanie, Alex, Yitza, Mysterious Donor Dude, Elise, Allison, Brandon, Arini, Lou, Jesse, Paige, Daniel, Darren, Daniel, Janice, Anne, Madeline, and Jeff. Podcasting isn't free and grad school doesn't pay very well, so if you're interested in joining with our current patrons to keep the show running, take a look at our Patreon at patreon.com/tipsytolstoy. The music used in this episode was Soviet March by Toasted Tomatoes. You can find more of their stuff on toastedtomatoes.bandcamp.com and also on YouTube under the same username. If you're looking for other places to find us, you can also follow us on Instagram at Tipsy Tolstoy Podcast, on Twitter at Tipsy Tolstoy, or you can join our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com. You'll hear from us again soon.